Right now, in central London, in a Georgian townhouse on St James's Square, there is a meeting taking place. You do not know who is in that room. You're not supposed to. If a former Prime Minister is sitting across from the chief executive of an arms company, you will never find out. If the head of MI6 is explaining British intelligence strategy to a private audience of oil executives, and he has done exactly that, nobody is permitted to tell you what was said. The building is 650 metres from Downing Street. The organisation is a registered charity, and the rule that keeps you out of that room was written in 1927. It has worked perfectly ever since. This is Chatham House. Let us start with the rule, because the rule is the mechanism, and everything else makes more sense once you understand what it actually does and what it was designed to do. Most people who have ever invoked it at a work event have never read it. Here is the exact text, one sentence from their own website. When a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House Rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speaker or speakers nor that of any other participant may be revealed. Take a moment with that, because the part most people focus on is the secrecy, the bit about not revealing who was in the room. But read the first clause again. Participants are free to use the information received. That is the part that actually matters. You can act on it. You can make policy based on it. You can invest money based on it. You can write legislation based on it. You can structure a defence procurement decision based on it. You just cannot say who told you. The information flows. The accountability does not. Think about what that means when it's applied to the kind of people and conversations that actually happen in that building. A cabinet minister sits in a room. Someone from a major defence contractor lays out the case for a particular weapons programme, the strategic argument, the cost projections, the geopolitical rationale, the whole pitch. The minister walks into Parliament the next day and argues exactly that case, and argues it well because they heard it laid out by professionals the previous evening. Nobody, not the press gallery, not the opposition front bench, not a freedom of information request, can surface who said what in that room, because the Chatham House Rule was invoked at the start of the session, all perfectly legal, all completely protected. Note the enforcement. If you break the rule, their own FAQ says you will likely be excluded from future events. That is it. The penalty for disclosing to the public what was said in a room full of oil executives and government ministers is that you do not get invited back next time. The honour system for people in rooms where honour often has a very specific and limited application. The rule was first written in June 1927. It was refined in 1992 and again in 2002. And it does not only apply to meetings that physically take place inside that building on St James's Square. Any meeting anywhere in the world can invoke the Chatham House Rule. A dinner in Washington, a conference in Singapore, a private gathering in a hotel suite at Davos, a conversation on the sidelines of a multilateral summit. Chatham House itself says that most of its public events these days are on the record, which is designed to sound reassuring. The meetings that are on the record tend to be the ones where the discussion is general enough that it does not matter who said what. The meetings that invoke the rule are the ones where the specific combination of who is in the room, saying what to whom, would be inconvenient if it emerged. And for the conversations most sensitive of all, they go fully off the record, meaning the rule itself is not considered sufficient protection, and nothing that was said can be attributed to anyone in any form. Layers of privacy, calibrated precisely to the sensitivity of the discussion. I want to show you what this looks like when serious money's involved. Yes, because it makes the real-world stakes concrete. In May 2015, a member of the European Central Bank's Executive Board gave a speech at a private conference held under the Chatham House Rule. The content was not made public until the following morning. When it went public, the euro dropped more than 1.5%. Bond markets moved. Stock markets moved. Significant sums changed hands. The people who were in that room the previous evening had heard that speech a full 24 hours before the rest of the world. 24 hours of market-moving information, held exclusively by a private group of attendees, protected by a gentleman's agreement that had been written in 1927, when most of the financial instruments those markets are now built on did not yet exist. That is not a hypothetical risk or a theoretical concern. That is a documented historical event, and the rule functioning precisely as it was designed to function. Information flows to the people in the room. The accountability for what they do with it does not follow. The Bilderberg Group, the annual gathering of roughly 130 senior politicians, chief executives, and security officials that has been meeting since 1954, uses the Chatham House Rule for every single session. Every one of them. Over 70 years of annual meetings, 0 published minutes, 0 transcripts, not one document in the public record that tells you what was actually discussed in those rooms over 7 decades of global geopolitics. A funding transparency organisation called Who Funds You gave Chatham House a B rating in 2024, not an A B. Meanwhile, millions of people across the corporate world have been invoking the Chatham House rules, plural and wrong, the rule is singular, at their team brainstorming sessions, which tells you with reasonable precision how carefully the general public has engaged with what the organisation behind that phrase actually is and what it actually does. So that is the mechanism. One sentence, approaching 100 years old, that says the powerful do not have to explain themselves in these particular rooms. But the rule only tells you how the room is protected. Let us talk about who is paying for the room, because the money tells a very specific story. According to the Charity Commission filing for the year ending March 2025, Chatham House had a total annual income of just over £20 million. Of that, nearly 14 million is classified as charitable activities income, meaning research contracts and grants. About 4.5 million comes from donations, around 1.25 million from trading income, the rest from investments. Now hold on to that breakdown, because there is a specific phrase on the Chatham House website that I want you to carry with you as we go through the funding in detail. The phrase is this: the Institute receives no subsidy from the UK government. Go to the Charity Commission filing. Government grant income for the year 2024 to 2025. 0. Not a penny appears under that heading in the official paperwork, clean as a whistle officially, except that the Foreign Office is listed as a partner-level funder. Partner level is their highest funding tier, the top of the donor pyramid. So is the Ministry of Defence. The Department for Business and Trade is listed as a major corporate member. The British Army is a major corporate member. An older publicly available donor list shows the Cabinet Office, HM Treasury, the Department of Health, and the House of Commons Library all paying into the organisation at various levels. So how does an institution that receives money from the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, the British Army, and multiple other government departments maintain, with a straight face, that it receives no subsidy from the UK government? Either the trick is in the classification. When government money flows to Chatham House, it flows as project-specific research contracts, not as a general operational subsidy. So technically, and they would be very firm about the technically. They're telling the truth. The government does not subsidise them in the sense of giving money to keep the lights on and pay the staff. It simply pays them to produce specific pieces of research, which the government then uses to inform policy, often citing it as independent expert analysis in support of positions the government had already reached. Nothing improper about any individual transaction. It is only when you look at the aggregate, at the pattern of who commissions what and who uses the results, and who then gets appointed to run the institution that commissioned the research, that the shape of the arrangement becomes visible. But honestly, as significant as the government money is, it is almost a sideshow compared to the rest of the funding list. At the partner level, the highest tier, we have BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Equinor, and Crescent Petroleum, which is UAE-based. That is 7 out of 24 partner-level funders who are oil and gas companies. Chatham House also runs a climate change and energy transition research program. They say that energy company money funds general operations and membership, but not the specific environment and society research centre or particular public events. Separate accounting categories, on paper, within the same organisation, funded by the same donors, governed by the same board. You can decide what you think that separation is worth in practice. Among the major corporate members you have BAE Systems and Northrop Grumman, which are arms manufacturers, paying to belong to an organisation that produces research on defence policy and international security and arms control. You have McKinsey, you have HSBC, you have Novartis, you have Apple, you have Bloomberg. The BBC is a paying corporate member of an institution where the BBC Director General gives speeches and whose research papers are cited regularly in BBC news coverage as independent expert analysis. The BBC pays membership fees into Chatham House. Chatham House produces analysis. The BBC reports the analysis as coming from an independent think tank. TikTok and Huawei are both major corporate members of an organisation that simultaneously publishes research papers warning about the threat posed by Chinese technology companies and Chinese state influence operations in Western democracies. I did not invent any of that. That is just what the membership list and the research catalogue say when you read them alongside each other. Perhaps the most illustrative example of how these funding arrangements play out in practice came in 2011, when the Bureau of Investigative Journalism revealed that a Chatham House seminar on democratic reform in Bahrain had been funded by a lobbying firm working directly for the Kingdom of Bahrain. The Bahrain Human Rights Monitor described the event as propagandistic. Saudi Arabia's Decision Support Centre is a major corporate member. The embassies of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman all pay for membership at various levels. The Gulf states, whose democratic credentials and human rights records are, to put it diplomatically, among the more contested topics in global affairs, are all paying into an organisation that produces research on global governance, democratic norms, and human rights frameworks. Inside the organisation, 52 employees earn more than £60,000 a year. The director's annual salary sits somewhere between £250,000 and £300,000. At a registered charity, that is the money. But the money only tells you who is paying. What tells you rather more about what the institution actually is who is running it and where they came from. There is a pattern to how Chatham House fills its most senior leadership positions, and once you see it clearly, it is very hard to look away from. The pattern is this: you spend a career at the very top of the British state, in intelligence, in diplomacy, in the cabinet, in Downing Street. your official career ends through retirement or election defeat, or the ordinary rotation of senior appointments, and then you walk across St. James's Square and take a seat at Chatham House, not as an occasional speaker or an honorary associate, but as one of the people running the institution. Baroness Eliza Manningham Buller was Director General of MI5 from 2002 to 2007. She was, in those years, the head of Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, the person ultimately responsible for everything that MI5 did, including its surveillance operations, its counter-terrorism work, and its relationships with allied intelligence agencies. She became co-president of Chatham House and held that position for a decade, from 2015 to 2025, 10 years of the former head of domestic intelligence governing Britain's premier foreign affairs institution and foreign policy research organisation. When she stepped down, she was replaced by Theresa May, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2016 to 2019. May was appointed co-president in September 2025, serving alongside Baroness Valerie Amos, herself a former cabinet minister, former leader of the House of Lords, and former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and until recently Mark Carney, who served as Governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020 and is currently serving as Prime Minister of Canada, was also a Chatham House co-president, just a normal charity board. The chair of the governing council is Sir Simon Fraser. Fraser served as permanent Under-Secretary of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office from 2010 to 2015. That is the most senior civil servant in the entire British foreign policy apparatus, the person who runs the Foreign Office day to day beneath the minister. He moved from that role to chairing the independent think tank that advises on foreign policy, while simultaneously co-founding Flint Global, a private business advisory firm whose clients are companies with interest in exactly the policy areas that Chatham House researches. 3 roles, connected through the same institutional relationships and the same depth of knowledge held by the same person. His predecessor as chair was Sir Nigel Sheinwald, former British ambassador to the United States and former personal foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister. The current director, the person running the day-to-day operation, is Bronwyn Maddox, formerly of The Times, formerly chief executive of Prospect magazine, formerly director of the Institute for Government. She was already sitting on the Chatham House Council before her appointment to lead it. She is simultaneously an honorary governor of the Ditchley Foundation, another elite foreign policy institution whose membership and donor base overlap substantially with Chatham House's own. The world becomes very small very quickly as you approach the top of this particular institutional pyramid. The most revealing individual career story is what happened when the previous director, Sir Robin Niblett, left the organisation. Niblett ran Chatham House for 15 years. Under his tenure, the organisation tripled in size, growing to over 200 staff. He was awarded a knighthood for services to international relations. When he departed in 2022, he joined Hakluyt and Company as senior advisor. Hakluyt is a strategic intelligence advisory firm. It was founded by former MI6 officers. It is also a Chatham House corporate member, meaning it pays membership fees into the organisation whose former director it then hired as a senior advisor. The former director of Chatham House went to work for an intelligence firm built by ex-MI6 officers that pays money back into Chatham House. Simultaneously, Niblett joined the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He co-chaired a World Economic Forum Council, and he sat on the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office's own expert advisory group, a position he had held since 2019, which means that for the last 3 years of his Chatham House directorship, he was simultaneously advising the British Foreign Office on the same policy areas where Chatham House was producing research, funded in part by that same Foreign Office. In September 2026, he becomes Warden of New College, Oxford. As I said, nice work if you can get it. The most recent publicly documented senior hire is also instructive. Laurel Rapp served as Deputy Director of the US Secretary of State's Policy Planning Staff until January 2025. By September of that year, she had crossed the Atlantic and joined Chatham House as Program Director for the United States and North America. The pipeline runs in both directions and crosses oceans without any friction whatsoever. People move from the highest levels of state intelligence and diplomatic service into the institution, and back out again into advisory firms, government bodies, academic institutions, and corporate boards, carrying with them the relationships, the institutional knowledge, and the access that their time at the top of the British state gave them. And then there is the single event that I think captures the whole arrangement better than any structural analysis. Richard Moore, chief of MI6, gave what was billed as a director's briefing at Chatham House, titled "What Does Global Britain Mean for M116?" The event was restricted to partner and major corporate members only, not open to the public, not accessible to press, not available to members of Parliament. BP could attend and hear what the head of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service had to say about Britain's intelligence strategy and global ambitions. Shell could, BAE Systems could, HSBC could. The embassies of Gulf states that hold membership could send representatives. You could not go. Parliament could not hear it. The people whose taxes fund MI6 and who theoretically exercise democratic oversight of British foreign policy through their elected representatives could not get in the door. But the oil companies and the arms manufacturers were in the room, and the conversation was protected by a rule written in 1927. I am not sure you could design a cleaner illustration of what this institution actually is and who it actually serves, if you tried. So the question underneath all of this, the one that the website and the annual report and the award ceremonies and the independent branding do not answer, is how we got here. How does a registered charity end up governed by prime ministers and spy chiefs, funded by arms manufacturers and Gulf state governments, producing research for the state while officially not being funded by the state, yet hosting private intelligence briefings for oil companies, all under a secrecy rule that is approaching its 100th birthday? The answer starts not in London, but in Paris, and it starts at a very specific moment. The 30th of May, 1919. The Hotel Majestic in Paris, where the British delegation to the Paris Peace Conference was staying. These were the men tasked with carving up the post-war world, drawing borders that would stand for decades, writing the treaties that shaped the rest of the century, deciding who got what from the wreckage of the First World War. And in one of the rooms of that hotel, a man named Lionel Curtis gathered roughly 30 British and American delegates and made a proposal. A permanent Anglo-American Institute of International Affairs, one organisation, 2 offices, London and New York. A shared transatlantic institution through which the 2 great English-speaking imperial powers could coordinate their analysis of the world and their approach to running it, across governments, across electoral cycles, in a form that would persist regardless of which party was in office on either side of the Atlantic. Curtis was not a random diplomat or a junior functionary with an idea. He was a protege of Alfred Milner, 1st Viscount Milner. And Milner is where this history turns considerably darker than the official Chatham House narrative ever goes. Alfred Milner was High Commissioner for Southern Africa and Governor of Cape Colony in the years around the turn of the 20th century. His policies in that role directly precipitated the Second Boer War, a conflict that killed tens of thousands of people, including a very large number of Boer women and children in the concentration camps that the British Army ran in the latter stages of the war, and which was not, by any serious historical assessment, a high point in the British Imperial record. After British victory, Milner assembled a group of young Oxford-educated administrators to run the conquered territories. They were called, in a phrase that blends the paternalistic with the sinister, Milner's kindergarten. Lionel Curtis, the man who proposed Chatham House in that Paris hotel room, was one of them. Philip Kerr, who later became Lord Lothian and the British ambassador to the United States, was another. Geoffrey Dawson, who would serve as editor of the Times for many years, and who used that platform consistently in ways that reflected the network's priorities and assumptions, was a third. These were not peripheral figures. They were the men who administered British imperial power in southern Africa after the Boer War, and who then went on to shape British foreign policy institutions and British foreign policy media for the subsequent decades. Milner's racial views are not a matter of inference or interpretation. They are in his own writing. His personal credo, found among his papers after his death, and quoted directly by multiple historians who examined those papers, described him as a British, and primarily an English, nationalist, whose imperial project represented nothing less than the destiny of the English race. His racial assumptions shaped everything he did in southern Africa. The administrative systems that he and his kindergarten built in the Transvaal after the Boer War were documented by historian Keith Breckenridge as specifically and deliberately designed to control the identities, the movements, and the economic behaviour of black workers in the interest of white industrial and agricultural capital. The Lagden Commission, established under Milner's administration and driven by his priorities, formalised racial segregation as official administrative policy across South Africa. The framework that Commission produced became one of the foundational blueprints for the apartheid system that would govern South Africa for the next 4 decades, that would imprison Nelson Mandela for 27 years, and whose consequences, economic and social, persist in South Africa to this day. Curtis, the man who sat in the Hotel Majestic and proposed what became Chatham House, spent his entire subsequent career advocating for imperial federation and for world government under Anglo-Saxon leadership. His 3-volume work, Civitas Dei, described in one biographical account in almost messianic terms the unique destiny of the British Commonwealth as the literal manifestation of the city of God upon earth, the divine plan made real through British imperial power. Another scholar summarised his life's project as a blueprint for the transition from direct colonial rule to a form of globalised neo-colonialism, maintaining the substance of imperial dominance while adapting its institutional forms to a world in which the direct colonial model was becoming politically and militarily untenable. These are not hostile or fringe interpretations. These are assessments made by academic historians who spent careers with the primary sources, and these are the men who built Chatham House. Not peripheral to its founding, not distant influences, the intellectual architects, the people who defined what the institution was for, who it was meant to serve, and what kind of world it was meant to help maintain. The British and American groups that emerged from that Paris meeting eventually formalised into 2 separate organisations. The British Institute of International Affairs held its inaugural meeting on the 5th of July 1920. Among its first presidents was Arthur Balfour, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and author of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the letter in which the British government declared its support for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a document of roughly 67 words whose consequences shaped the politics of the Middle East for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The initial working capital for the new organization came from a gift of $2,000 from Thomas W. Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, connecting the new institution to the dominant force in American finance from its very first days. The American group that emerged from the same Paris meeting became the Council on Foreign Relations. Chatham House still formally describes the Council on Foreign Relations as its U.S. sister institute. But the Council on Foreign Relations now has an endowment exceeding $565 million and has produced the foreign policy thinking of multiple American administrations from the Marshall Plan onward. The Royal Charter for Chatham House was granted on the 16th of July 1926 by King George V. Among those who petitioned for the charter was the man who had become Edward VIII. The current patron is King Charles III, who formally confirmed his patronage in May 2024. Carol Quigley, a professor at Georgetown University, who spent 20 years studying this network and who'd been given direct access to the internal papers of its core institutions, wrote that the Royal Institute of International Affairs is nothing but the Milner Group writ large. That is not a hostile characterization from a journalist or a conspiracy researcher. That is from a scholar who was trusted enough with the private papers to actually know what they said. Inderjeet Parmar, whose peer-reviewed research on Anglo-American elite networks is considered among the most rigorous academic work on the subject, confirmed that Chatham House was deeply embedded in political, economic and military elites from its founding and functioned primarily as a mechanism for elite consensus building rather than as an independent research institution in any straightforward sense. So the institution that today says its mission is to help build a sustainably secure, prosperous and just world was founded by documented racial imperialists, organised by a man who described the British Empire in explicitly messianic terms, and bankrolled from its first days by J.P. Morgan. Institutional DNA does not wash out. The founding assumptions shape operational culture across generations in ways that are often invisible to the people who work within the institution and take its basic premises for granted. The intelligence services understood the value of the arrangement early, even before Chatham House was fully established in its current form. During the Second World War, Chatham House ran an operation called the Foreign Research and Press Service, physically based at Balliol College, Oxford. This operation produced intelligence memoranda directly at the request of the Foreign Office, the War Office, the Admiralty, and the intelligence services. This is documented in Chatham House's own institutional records, not in any hostile account. A registered charity, sect, producing intelligence products for the state, funded by the state, while officially maintaining its status as an independent institution. After the war ended, the role of director of Chatham House went to Christopher Montague Woodhouse. Before taking that position, Woodhouse had been MI6 head of station in Tehran. More specifically, he was the British officer most directly responsible for planning and executing the MI6 CIA joint operation that overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, removing a nationalist prime minister who had moved to nationalise the Anglo-Iranian oil company, and replacing the elected government with a more pliable arrangement under the Shah. The consequences of that operation played out across the following decades: the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the hostage crisis, the subsequent antagonism between Iran and the West that continues to shape Middle Eastern geopolitics today. The man who planned one of the 20th century's most consequential covert intelligence operations then became the director of Britain's most prominent independent foreign policy institution. Brian Crozier worked at Chatham House for 11 years. His connections to both the CIA and MI6 during that period were not publicly disclosed and only became clearer after he left. The relationship between the institution and the intelligence world was not incidental or occasional. It was woven into the institutional fabric from the beginning, and the relationship ran in both directions, which is itself instructive. According to reporting in the Times, an East German Stasi officer, known by the cover name Eckhart, successfully penetrated Chatham House and maintained access for at least 6 years during the 1980s. He was sending reports back to East Berlin on Royal Navy manoeuvres, problems within the NATO alliance, and the conduct and outcomes of the Falklands conflict. The intelligence services of both sides of the Cold War understood that Chatham House was worth penetrating, that people inside it said things in relative confidence that were genuinely valuable to know, that the institution was close enough to the centres of British power that access to it represented real intelligence value. The spies wanted in from every direction, which tells you something about how seriously the people in that world took what happened inside that building on St. James's Square. There are moments in the organisation's history that its defenders point to as evidence of genuine independence from the governments and corporations that fund it, and it is worth taking those moments seriously rather than dismissing them. In 2005, Chatham House published a paper by their director at the time, alongside a security analyst, that described the United Kingdom as a pillion passenger in the American War on Terror, and called the Iraq War a strategic disaster for Britain. The Blair government was furious. Senior Downing Street figures briefed against the organisation. The report was attacked as unhelpful, politically motivated and poorly timed. It generated significant press coverage and caused genuine friction between Chatham House and the government of the day. But look carefully at what that report actually said, and what it did not say. It did not question whether Britain should be engaged in the kind of global security activity that leads it into these entanglements. It did not challenge the Anglo-American intelligence relationship, the defence procurement relationships, the energy security frameworks that connect British foreign policy to specific corporate interests. It did not ask whether the arms manufacturers and oil companies on the donor list might have interests that shaped British policy in the region. It argued narrowly and precisely that the government was pursuing the correct kind of foreign policy in the wrong way and with the wrong results, and criticism from inside the establishment, in the language of the establishment, for the purpose of improving establishment performance, not questioning establishment premises. Even the moments of apparent independence serve the fundamental project. Chatham House does not exist alone in this landscape. It is one node in a network of elite policy institutions that overlap substantially in their membership, their funding, their leadership, and their shared assumptions about how the world should be ordered. The Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Chatham House are all real organisations. They all have documented connections to each other through personnel, through shared donors, through the movement of the same individuals between them over the course of their careers, Then one figure in particular illustrates how thoroughly this network transcends the political divisions that most people use to understand the world. Dennis Healey was a central figure in the British Labour Party through the Cold War decades. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had been Secretary of State for Defence. He was simultaneously a Chatham House councillor, a member of the Bilderberg Steering Committee that organised the annual meeting, a founding member of the Trilateral Commission, and a member of the Fabian Society's Executive Committee. Same person, all four institutions, different buildings and different letterheads, but in the ways that actually matter to how policy is shaped and how elite consensus is built and maintained, the same table. The network does not respect the left-right division that structures most people's political understanding. It operates underneath that division, in a layer of institutional relationships and shared assumptions about who should be running the world and roughly how that proceed and persist across changes of government. I want to be specific about what it means to say. The picture becomes clear when you see it whole, because the individual elements of this story are routinely explained away when they come up in isolation. The oil company funding is reported somewhere and then moves on. The leadership appointments from the intelligence community and the cabinet are noted in an appointments diary, and then forgotten. The academic work on the Milner Group connection sits in peer-reviewed journals that most people never encounter. The Second World War intelligence operation is in the institutional history. The story of the Stasi penetration appeared in one newspaper report. None of these things has been assembled into a coherent picture in a format that reaches the people most affected by what this institution does, which is all of us. That is not an accident. It is a function of how this particular type of power works. The protection it enjoys is not primarily legal or technical, it is cultural. The assumption, broadly shared and rarely examined, that this is simply how foreign policy institutions work. That the movement of former intelligence chiefs and prime ministers into the leadership of think tanks is a normal and unremarkable feature of the policy landscape. That organisations funded by arms manufacturers and Gulf states can reasonably claim to produce independent research on arms control and Gulf state governance. That a secrecy rule written in 1927 by and for Imperial administrators remains the appropriate framework for governing conversations between serving MI6 chiefs and major oil companies in the 21st century. These assumptions go largely unchallenged, because the people best positioned to challenge them are themselves often connected to the network, directly or through institutions that share its assumptions and its personnel. What I personally find most striking about all of this is not any single fact, but the scale of the confidence it represents. These are not people operating in secret, they are not hiding. The funding is filed with the Charity Commission, or the leadership appointments are announced in the press. The donor list, when published, is public. The events calendar is on the website. The organisation has a royal charter, a patron who is the king, and an annual income of £20 million. It operates in total institutional daylight, and it has done so for 100 years, because it does not need to hide. The arrangement is so thoroughly embedded in the normal furniture of British institutional life that most people who are aware of it at all treat it as a background feature of the landscape, rather than as something that requires examination or explanation. That is not hiding. That is something more interesting than hiding. That is a level of institutional confidence that only comes from 100 years of operating without any serious challenge. A registered charity, just over £20 million in annual income, funded at its highest tier by 7 oil and gas companies, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence, and the British Army. Governed by a former head of MI5, a former Prime Minister, and a former Governor of the Bank of England. Chaired by the former permanent head of the Diplomatic Service. Running research programs on climate change and human rights and democratic governance. Funded in part by the Gulf states whose climate records and human rights practices are among the subjects of those programs. Operating under a rule from 1927 that says the powerful do not have to account publicly for what they say in these rooms. Founded by men who believed in explicit and documented terms that the destiny of the English race was to run the world, and that the British Empire was the earthly manifestation of divine purpose. Ranked second in the world in the Global Go-To Think Tank Index. Funded every year for a century by the government that officially says it does not fund it. Patched into the intelligence community through a network of personnel and institutional relationships that runs continuously from the founding to the present. Sitting, right now, 650 metres from the front door of Downing Street, holding meetings that you are not allowed to know about, under a rule designed to make sure you never find out. The question is not whether Chatham House has influence over British foreign policy. That is beyond obvious, and they do not even deny it. The question is whether in a democracy any institution should have the power to write that rule. The rule that says the powerful do not have to explain themselves when they meet privately with the people whose interests their decisions serve, and whether 100 years of every British government being comfortable with that arrangement is a sign that the arrangement serves the democratic interest, or a sign of something rather different. If you want to follow this thread further, the natural next place to look is the Council on Foreign Relations, the American organization that grew out of the same Paris hotel meeting in 1919, that now sits on an endowment of over $565 million, and whose influence over American foreign policy thinking has run continuously from the architects of the post-war international order through every subsequent administration. The personnel overlap with Chatham House is substantial. The founding ideology is identical, because the founding was literally the same event, the same room, the same people, the same purpose, before the British and American groups went their separate ways. When you understand Chatham House, you're already most of the way to understanding what the Council on Foreign Relations is and how it operates. Different flag, same room. We're going to walk through that room in the same kind of detail we went through this one today. I want to know what you think about this. Not the version where everything is secretly coordinated from a single control room, and not the dismissive version where this is just how things work and there is nothing worth discussing. The real version. The version where an institution with a royal charter and a charity registration has operated for 100 years, at the intersection of British state power and private industrial and financial interests, with no serious public accountability mechanism, and where every government in that period has treated this as normal. Leave it in the comments below. I read them, and this is exactly the kind of question worth arguing about properly. See you in the next one. There is another dimension to this story that deserves its own space, and that is the question of what Chatham House actually produces, day to day, and who that production serves. Because the institution is not only a meeting room protected by a secrecy rule, it publishes, it holds public events, it puts research into the world under its name, and that research gets cited, used, broadcast, repeated, and it shapes how the people who shape policy think about the problems they're working on. Understanding who produces that research, on what mandate and in whose interest matters. Chatham House employs around 180 staff, of whom several dozen are researchers working across programs on subjects including international law, global health, international economics, climate change, conflict and fragility, and the digital society, among others. Some of this research is genuinely rigorous. Some of it is of the quality you would expect from a well-funded institution with good academic connections and 100 years of institutional knowledge about how British foreign policy works. None of that is in question. The question is not whether Chatham House produces capable research. The question is what assumptions that research operates within and whose interests those assumptions serve when they are acted upon. Consider the climate research. Chatham House has a significant program on climate change and energy transition. It produces reports on emissions pathways, on the geopolitics of the energy transition, on the risks of climate inaction. It makes the case, publicly and with some force, for faster action on decarbonisation. At the same time, 7 of its 24 highest-level funders are oil and gas companies. The people running BP and Shell and ExxonMobil and Chevron are not funding Chatham House because they want independent research. That might make the case for policies that damage their revenue. They are not philanthropists. They are business people who pay for membership because membership gives them access to the briefings, access to the conversations, access to the people in government who make the regulatory and fiscal decisions that govern how quickly and on what terms their industry is required to transition. The climate research that Chatham House produces, whatever its quality, is produced within a structure where the people most affected by its policy implications are sitting at the table that funds it. That is not a small thing. That is a structural conflict of interest that no amount of accounting separation between different budget lines can fully resolve. The same logic applies across every substantive research area. The defence and security research is funded partly by the Ministry of Defence and partly by arms manufacturers. The international economics research operates in an environment where major banks and financial institutions are paying members. The research on governance and accountability in the Gulf is produced by an institution that receives significant funding from Gulf state governments. In each case, you can point to individual pieces of research that reach conclusions their funders would prefer they did not reach. Chatham House does not simply produce whatever its donors want. It is not that crude. But the structural reality is that the questions researchers are asked to focus on, the policy options they are asked to evaluate, and the institutional assumptions within which they are working, these are all shaped by the funding environment and the leadership appointments in ways that tend to constrain rather than challenge the fundamental interests of the people paying for the institution. And then there is the question of how Chatham House research reaches the public, which is worth thinking through carefully because it tells you something about the institution's actual function in the information landscape. Chatham House has an excellent press operation. Its research is regularly picked up by major newspapers and broadcast outlets. It is cited on the BBC, in The Guardian, in the Financial Times, in The Times. When a Chatham House expert appears on television to discuss, say, British foreign policy in the Middle East, they are presented as an independent analyst, a representative of a serious research institution. The BBC's corporate membership of Chatham House is not mentioned. The Foreign Office funding is not mentioned. The Gulf State membership fees are not mentioned. The fact that the director of this independent institution earned her position, having already served on its council, and that her predecessor went directly to an intelligence advisory firm funded by former MI6 officers is not mentioned. None of this is secret. It is simply not considered relevant context for a television audience, which is again a form of the open secrecy that characterizes the whole arrangement. The information is available to anyone who goes and looks for it. It simply never appears in the context where it would be most useful to the people making sense of what they are watching and reading. Now I want to go back and dwell on something I mentioned earlier, because I think it deserves more attention than a passing reference. The question of Chatham House's role during the Cold War, and specifically the relationship between the institution and both sides of the East-West intelligence competition, reveals something important about what Chatham House actually is, as distinct from what it says it is. The wartime intelligence work I mentioned, the Foreign Research and Press Service producing memoranda for the Foreign Office and the intelligence services, was not an anomaly. It was a formalization of something that had been true from the beginning, which is that Chatham House was understood by the people who built it and used it as a resource of the British state, not as an independent institution that happened to be consulted. The boundary between the institution and the state apparatus, and between the charity and the government, was always porous at the operational level, even when it was maintained formally on paper. The distinction between a research organisation that produces analysis for government and an intelligence operation that produces analysis for government is, at a certain level of integration, a distinction without a difference. The figure of Christopher Montague Woodhouse illustrates this with particular clarity. Here is a man who planned and executed a covert operation that removed an elected foreign government acting on behalf of British and American oil interests and strategic priorities that had nothing to do with Iranian democratic preferences, and who then moved seamlessly into the role of leading the institution supposedly dedicated to independent analysis of international affairs. The transition required no explanation, prompted no public discussion, generated no apparent concern within the institution or among its funders, because within the culture of that world, within the assumptions shared by the people who ran Chatham House and filled its governing bodies and attended its meetings, Woodhouse was exactly the right kind of person for the job. He was experienced in the realities of how British power was exercised in the world. He understood how things actually worked. He was connected to the right people in the right institutions. His particular form of experience, organising the overthrow of a foreign government, was an asset in that context, not a disqualification. The Stasi penetration in the 1980s is in its own way equally revealing. The East Germans did not try to infiltrate Chatham House because it was an ordinary think tank. They did not bother with most British universities or research institutions. They targeted Chatham House because the people inside it were close enough to real British power that the conversations happening there were intelligence of real value. An agent inside Chatham House could hear things that an agent inside a university department or a civil service press office could not hear, because the people at Chatham House spoke more freely, with less official caution, confident that the Chatham House Rule would protect the room. The Stasi understood what the Chatham House Rule was worth, and they exploited it. The irony is not small. A secrecy rule designed to encourage candour among the Western elite ended up channeling information about NATO and the Royal Navy to East German intelligence. The mechanism worked as intended. It just worked for everyone in the room, including the ones who were not supposed to be there. I want to spend a moment on the geography, because geography in this story is not incidental. 650 metres from Downing Street. That distance matters. It is close enough to walk in 10 minutes. It is close enough that a meeting at Chatham House is, in the practical rhythms of the London working day, essentially a meeting in the same professional neighbourhood as the centre of government. The people who work in the buildings along Whitehall, in the Foreign Office, in the Treasury, in the Cabinet Office, are not going on a journey when they attend an event at Chatham House. They're going around the corner. The physical proximity reinforces and enables the institutional proximity. Ideas, perspectives, framings, concerns circulate between Chatham House and Whitehall in ways that are facilitated by the fact that the walk takes 10 minutes, and the attendee list at most serious Chatham House events includes people from both sides of that 10-minute walk. The institution is not external to the policy-making world. It is embedded in it geographically as well as institutionally. It is part of the same physical landscape as the buildings where British foreign policy is officially made, and the conversations that happen inside it are continuous with the conversations that happen inside those official buildings, not separate from them. The same physical logic applies to the network of clubs, dining rooms, and private venues that surround Chatham House in that part of London. The Travellers' Club, the Reform Club, the Athenaeum, Brooks's, the senior civil servants and former ministers and intelligence figures who sit on Chatham House's governing bodies also belong to these institutions. The conversations that begin at a Chatham House event under the rule continue over lunch at a club 3 streets away under an informal assumption of discretion that does not even need to be named. The formal secrecy mechanism of the Chatham House Rule is the tip of a much larger iceberg of informal arrangements, shared assumptions, and mutual understanding about what is and is not said outside a particular circle, that characterises the entire culture of the British establishment in that part of London. Chatham House did not invent that culture. It formalised one aspect of it, gave it a name and a rule and a charity registration, and placed it at the centre of the machinery through which foreign policy thinking is generated and legitimised. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we get to the conclusion, because it connects Chatham House to a set of questions about British democracy that go well beyond this single institution. The question of the revolving door, the movement of senior officials between government roles and private organisations, is a live and contested issue in British public life. There are parliamentary committees that examine it. There is an advisory committee called a Covert, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, that is supposed to scrutinise and approve certain senior moves between public roles and private positions. When you go and look at the appointments I've described in this video, the movements of former intelligence chiefs and former Foreign Office, permanent secretaries and former prime ministers into leadership roles at Chatham House, these moves are not primarily scrutinised by a Cobra. The framework for oversight that exists, imperfect as it is, does not fully capture what is happening when a former Director General of MI5 becomes co-president of an institution funded by arms companies and Gulf states, or when the former head of the diplomatic service becomes its chair while simultaneously running a private advisory firm. The existing oversight mechanisms were not built with this kind of arrangement in mind, and in some ways the arrangement has been structured in ways that make the existing mechanisms only partially applicable. The charity status, the specific classification of funding as research contracts rather than subsidies, the framing of the governing positions as voluntary public service rather than paid employment, all of these features of the institutional structure reduce the friction with oversight mechanisms that would otherwise apply. This may be deliberate. It may be an organic evolution of an institution adapting to its regulatory environment over 100 years. Either way, the result is the same. And the result is what we have been describing throughout this video. An institution that occupies a position at the very centre of British foreign policy, that hosts conversations between the most senior people in government and intelligence, and finance and arms and energy, that produces research that shapes how those conversations are framed, that is funded by the people whose interests are most directly served by the outcomes of those conversations, and that does all of this under a secrecy rule that ensures none of it is visible to the public whose lives are most directly affected by the policies that emerge. All of it legal, all of it above board, all of it operating in the same postcode as the buildings where British democracy is officially conducted, and all of it resting on a foundation laid by men who believed in explicit and documented terms that the purpose of British power was to fulfil the destiny of the English race, and that the proper form of that fulfilment in a changing world was not direct colonial rule but the kind of managed, institutional, apparently independent arrangement that Chatham House has embodied for 100 years. That is the full picture. Not a conspiracy in the sense of people meeting in secret to issue orders that are then covertly carried out. Something at once more ordinary and more durable than that. A network, a culture, a set of institutions that have reproduced the same assumptions and the same relationships and the same patterns of access and influence across a century of British history, surviving changes of government, changes in geopolitical circumstance, changes in the formal structures of empire and post-empire, adapting its form without changing its function, publishing annual reports and filing with the Charity Commission and putting research papers on the internet, open in every formal sense and protected from any serious accountability by the culture that treats all of this as unremarkable. The building is still there, the meetings are still happening, the rule is still in effect, and 650 metres away, the government of the day is still perfectly happy to keep it that way.